Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We'll give everyone about 2 minutes. But I'm here. This is Ed Blankenship at Microsoft, by the way, and I'm the product manager for our DevOps family of tools, including Visual Studio Team Services and Team Foundation Server and Application Insights and Hockey App. So we've got the Redgate team here. I'm really excited. Most of the questions that we get from a lot of our customers who come to talk to us, it's all about like, hey, I know how to ship my code through a continuous delivery pipeline, but how do I make sure that the database changes are part of that same continuous delivery pipeline? So really glad to have the Redgate team here. Like I said, we'll get started in about 60 more seconds. I'm really glad we have actually a really big crowd today, so I'm really excited about that. Now, something to note, there's several of us here that are going to be watching the Q&A session. So if you have any questions or answers, feel free to put those in the question and answer area, and then we will, from time to time, pick out some great questions, and then we also have some Q&A time at the end of the webinar today. So thank you again for joining us. We'll get started. All right, so David, Tom, are you there?
Certainly am.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we get started? So I've got David and Tom here from Redgate. And here you go. Here's the show.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. So as Ed said, we're really excited to be able to talk to you today about Database DevOps and how we can show you how to include the database in your DevOps pipeline. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name's Tom Austin. I've been with Redgate around about 9 years now, and I'm one of the lead pre-sales engineers working on our Database DevOps tools. I'm joined today by David Simner.
Cool. Hi, everyone. I'm David, and I'm a technical lead here at Redgate on the Database DevOps tools.
For those of you who aren't familiar with Redgate software, Redgate is a leading Microsoft SQL Server tools vendor. We've been a Microsoft Gold partner, Microsoft partner actually since 2001. So 17 years in database software with 91% of Fortune 100 customers using Redgate tools. And over 800,000 users worldwide. So if you haven't heard of us, hello, we're very pleased to be speaking to you. Hopefully we can get that 91% up to 100%. The reason we're here to talk to you today is of course, Database DevOps, and Redgate do specialize in tools to extend those DevOps processes to SQL Server databases. But what I really want to make clear here is that we're not just talking about on-premise SQL Server, we're also talking about Azure SQL databases. So all this talk of DevOps, David, what does DevOps mean?
Do you want to do this slide first, Tom?
Yeah, I certainly can. So the reason that we're partnering with Microsoft on the presentation for you guys today is because actually some of this functionality is being included in Visual Studio Enterprise 2017. So the tools and the processes that we're going to show you using Redgate technology is actually going to be available to all of you enterprise users. If you don't have an enterprise subscription, don't worry, you can actually download the free trials of this technology from redgate.com. But if you are an enterprise customer, please do make sure that you tick the data storage and processing workload, or you can download these extensions from the VS Marketplace.
Cool. And then let's go to the thing that Tom was slightly ahead of before. So for those of you who haven't come across DevOps before, there's a quote on the screen now. So DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable the continuous delivery of value to end users. So to start with, we're going to talk about the continuous delivery of value and why that's an important business benefit to do. And then once we've kind of motivated it as something we're going to be doing to get those benefits, we're then going to talk about the people and the process and the products and how to actually do it. But let's start off by talking about why DevOps is a good thing. So there are some business benefits to doing DevOps. And I'm a technical lead. I spend about half my time writing code. So once I've written a piece of code, a piece of software, maybe that's a feature or it's a bug fix. Once I've written that code, it's sitting in my source control repository. And at this point, it's essentially inventory. Until we release that bug fix or that piece of code to our customers aren't getting any value from it. And one of the things that we've learned in the software industry is from the car industry and the principles of lean manufacturing. So once we've written that code and it's sitting in our source control repository, we really want to ship that code to users as quickly as we can so that the users get the benefit of running that code and they get the value from doing that. So it's all about the faster delivery of this code that we've written. So once we've delivered that piece of code to our user, then we get to get some feedback from that user. So from the users in general. So maybe they like it, maybe they don't. Maybe it goes well, maybe it doesn't. But the point is we're getting that feedback that's coming into us. And we can use that feedback to iterate on the feature. And therefore we can turn the feature into something that more and more of our users love, and therefore they're getting more and more value from it. So the alternative is kind of the classic waterfall project where you work on something for 6 months and then you finally release it and you find out it wasn't what people wanted. And so the idea about DevOps is it moves us very much away from that mindset into the mindset of iterating on a feature. So shipping an early preview of it and then iterating faster and faster to really act on that feedback from our users. In terms of the business benefits of this, obviously delivering features that users like is a really good thing. It makes them love the piece of software, they buy it, they stick with it year after year. But you also get the first move advantage from shipping as soon as possible. So often software has a high degree of lock-in or network effects that make it difficult for users to switch to competitor products. So the business benefit of releasing quickly is that you can release ahead of your competitors, lock users into your software, and then it's harder for the people to move to a competitor later. So there's a whole bunch of business benefits around shipping quickly to customers. Now, because we're doing more and more releases, less is changing in each release. And that leads to a more stable operating environment. Because less is changing in each release, it makes each release less risky. If something does go wrong, it's often really, really quickly to work out what that thing was simply because less is changing. Also in the name DevOps is the idea that the development side and the operations side are coming together. It's about having this improved collaboration across these roles. It's about discovering problems earlier. So we're going to talk later on about one of the DevOps principles called shift left, which is about moving things that you might discover at the very end of the pipeline when you're deploying to production into development. So you're thinking about these things ahead of time, which just leads to less surprises at the end. And by thinking about these things earlier and by having this improved collaboration across the roles, it means that deployment failures are reduced. And unfortunately, when they do occur, okay, they've occurred, but it means that we can recover faster because less is changing each time and because we've got this increased collaboration. So, Tom, do you want to talk about some of the reports that have come out about DevOps recently?
Yeah, most definitely, David. So I think what you've given us there is a real understanding of the theory of why this is such a good idea. But what's interesting is whether or not that actually translates to real-world improvements. And so the recent State of DevOps report that was released actually gave us some really, really strong indications that this is true. This is a really good thing to be adopting. And so if we look at some of the numbers that we can see on the screen here, those organizations that are performing well against their DevOps objectives are really dramatically outperforming those lower performing organizations. So 200 times more frequently, that's a massive amount of deployments. And that's really, really backed up by the fact that 2,555 times faster lead times are available to those high-performing organizations. Those organizations can also recover 24 times faster and have 3 times lower change failure rates. So a gulf in between low and high. Fantastic news. The result of this actually is that those organizations are spending considerably less time on unplanned work and reworking things, and that combined with the generally faster throughput of that software means that actually there's an awful lot more time that they can spend on new stuff, new work, new features, new code. But again, this is very much the wider scope of DevOps. How does this relate to databases particularly? Well, for that, we can look at the State of DevOps report, State of Database DevOps report. And that gave us some more statistics that actually show that this is something that can move over into the database world, and in fact will. So within 2 years, 80% of companies are planning to adopt DevOps. It's no surprise to us that the biggest driver for including the database is to increase the speed and delivery of database changes in much the same way that you spoke about earlier, David. But the really interesting one for me is that 75% of the respondents to this survey have developers in their team who work across both the application and the database. So 75% of these people have already witnessed the benefit. They've already seen that it's possible, and they've already experienced the improvement, but they're only getting it in half of their job. So break it down for us based upon that quote, David. People, process, and products. What do we mean by that?
Cool, thanks, Tom. So we talked about why we're going to do DevOps and the business benefits behind it, and Tom's just talked through the reports. So now let's talk about how we actually do it. Well, there's no magic bullet to DevOps. It's about 3 things coming together: people, process, and products. And often it's a business transformation to do it. And it's cool because lots of the principles you can adopt kind of iteratively over time. So you can adopt some of the DevOps principles and then some more over time, and you become more and more DevOps on your DevOps journey. So it's about the people in a development team adopting this DevOps process and these DevOps principles and using products to help them do that. So you can't just install a product and just be doing DevOps. It's about the people on the development team following this process and these habits and these practices and using products to help them do that. And the idea about the products is it makes it easier to follow these habits and practices, it makes it easier to adopt them, and easier for the team to collaborate on these on this process. So Tom's going to talk about some more of the habits and practices in a bit, but first of all, I want to look at a process for how we might deploy an application to different environments. So what we've got on the left-hand side is we've got some developers who are working on an application. They're using source control, so source control in, say, VSTS. They've then got a continuous integration and release management pipeline, again, let's say in VSTS. So they're using the build side of things on VSTS to build their application, and then they're using the release side of things in VSTS to deploy their application out to different environments, testing, QA, staging, and finally a review and approval step before it goes to production. And that's what it might look like for an application. And what we're going to see on the next slide is what it might look like for the database. And you can see that the slides are basically the same. We've got this team on the left-hand side, this group of people following the process. And the cool thing about Database DevOps is you can follow exactly the same process for the application as you can for the database. Just as we source control our application code, we source control our database code as well. Just as we build our application and do continuous integration of it, we do that for the database as well. So we discover any errors that we might have made or any problems in the tests at the continuous integration time. And just so we can use automated release management to deploy our application to our different environments, we can use automated release management to deploy our database to different environments, testing, QA, staging, and obviously a review and approval stage before going into production. And just as in application DevOps, you've got the development team and the operation team coming together to do this process. In database DevOps, you've got the developers coming together with the DBA and the operations side of things to follow this process. That's kind of what it might look like for a database DevOps pipeline. And as I've been talking about, we can do all of this on VSTS, so that's Visual Studio Team Services. And we'll see in the demo later how we can use the build side of things in VSTS and the release management side of things in VSTS as well to automate all of this process to all the different environments. Here's just a screenshot, basically a teaser of what's coming. So this is VSTS, and we can see the dev and the QA environment here. Cool. Tom, do you want to talk about some of the challenges of extending DevOps to the database?
Yes, certainly, David. I'll be more than happy to. So databases are different. There's no escaping that fact. And we've talked a little bit about applications and how important Visual Studio Team Services are to making that a reality. But on the database side of things, we're left without some of those benefits historically. That's changing, and that's different now, and that's exactly what David and I would like to speak to you about today. So historically, DevOps is application-centric. There's no getting away from that. Tools and processes have been focused on the application, and it's true that application code lends itself to DevOps, whereas databases are not quite as flexible. But how is this changing? What's becoming different? What's in Visual Studio Team Services and the Redgate ReadyRoll technology that makes this possible? Well, before we speak about that, we really need to understand why databases are harder to handle. And so actually there's a few reasons that we can talk about. You can't just throw it away and start afresh. You can't get rid of the database and produce a new one. David, you've worked with databases for years. What are some of the struggles that your teams have encountered?
So as Tom just talked about there, with an application, if you're doing a new deployment of that application to Visual Studio Team Services, what you can do is you can take the running instance of the application, just throw it away, and just bring up the new version. And the reason why you can do that is that an application like a website, for example, doesn't have any state associated with it. And that's because all that state has been pushed out of the application and into the database. And what that means is that if you have a database, you can't just throw that away and bring up a new one. What you have to do is you have to instead upgrade that database in place to preserve the data in it. Because if you just threw the database away, you'd lose all the production data, so all the customers, all the orders, and that kind of thing. So you can't just bring up a new schema of the database. You have to upgrade the schema of the database in place, preserving all of the existing data. And we'll see later on in the demo how the tools let you handle that. Another thing is that the data in the database is often of two different kinds. We've got some production data in that database, some customers, some orders, and we definitely want to keep those, and we don't want those to change during the deployment. But then we might have some reference data. Maybe this is a list of countries in the world or a list of product categories or something like that. And for these cases, we want the definitive copy of that data to exist in source control, so that we've got all the benefits of source control of tracking, well, who's changing the list of countries in the world and who's changing the list of product categories. And so by splitting the data in two and handling some of the data in source control and making sure that when we do a deployment to the different environments, we deploy out the new set of that reference data, but keeping the other part of the data in the database separate, as this must not go in source control and it must not change between deployments. So we have to kind of split the database into these two different types of data. There were some other problems as well, so teamwork and testing. So for example, if I get a local checkout in my application code, I can often just click build and start in Visual Studio, and the application starts up, which is great for applications, but what happens for databases? How do I get one of those as a new developer? How do I get realistic test data in there? All that kind of problems. And finally, it's database drift. It's basically unheard of for someone to take an application that's running in production and just go and hack on it and change some of the lines of C# code. But with the database, people do make changes on the database in production. So maybe there's a performance problem and they might add an index or something like that. And while this is great for fixing the performance problem, it makes the next deployment tricky, because either the next deployment might remove this index, or it might, because that index isn't present in the testing environments, it might mean that what we thought works in test doesn't run on production because of that extra index. So we need some kind of strategy for handling this database drift as part of our process, and we'll come to that in a minute. So we've been talking a lot about kind of how to deploy databases, but now let's go into some of the details. So Tom, how might we actually handle this kind of thing in practice?
Well, this is the thing, you have a choice. There's a couple of options, but you need to pick one. You need to pick an approach of how you're going to handle dealing with database change. And because of all those reasons that you described there, David, and actually our CEO, Simon Galbraith, gave an interview last week where he described handling database changes like trying to saddle a horse whilst riding it, which I think is a great analogy. It really is something that's tough to handle. But there's a couple of approaches that have come out, and I want to talk through each of those right now, if I may. So the first approach that I want to talk about, which is perhaps the traditional approach, the approach that we've seen more commonly in use in historic times, and that's the state-based approach. And what I mean by the state-based approach is that we are looking at the before and after versions, before the changes happened and after the changes happened, and then storing that information so that later on we can work out how to get from one state to the next. So another analogy, you know I love analogies, it's a bit like having a bag of ingredients and a picture of a cake. And you store those, and you have to try and work out, when it comes to deployment time, how to actually make that cake from your bag of ingredients. So we're less interested in this bit in the middle. We're less interested in actually how the change is made, but more interested in the point that we want to get to. Now, as I say, this has been the way that things have been done historically, David, but there's problems with this approach, right? It doesn't always fit our needs. What are those problems?
So the problems is, now I really can't bake cakes, and if you gave me a bag of ingredients and a picture of a finished cake, I'm not sure I'd be able to kind of work out the recipe or the steps to get there. And exactly the same happens with these kind of state-based deployment tools. So let's say that we've taken a full name column in our database and we've changed it. So instead of storing a full name of the customer, we're going to have two columns for their first name and their last name. So in terms of the state-based system, we store the before and after, and then the tool tries to work out what we did. Well, the tool takes a look and it says, well, that was a nice full name column you had there. Doesn't exist anymore. Don't worry, I'll get rid of that column for you. Two nice new columns you've got there. Don't worry, I'll just add those two new columns for you. And so it generates SQL a bit like you can see on the slide. Drops the old column and it adds the new columns. And while the tool does this, it will probably come out with a data loss warning for you because it's dropped this column. And the problem is, if you just drop all your names of your customers on production, it's not going to be good. So you need to understand the tool. What scenarios can it handle, and what scenarios, like a column split here, can't it handle? And it's not just a column split. I could have picked a column merge, I could have picked a table split, I could have picked a table merge, normalization, denormalization. There's a whole bunch of different changes that the tool can't handle. Now, while you can adopt this approach, the problem is that you need to have some way of overriding it one day. What happens if your developers want to split a table, split a column in this way? So what are you going to do about that? And the problem is, although you could say, well, for most deployments, we'll use that state-based deployment tool, but for a few deployments, we know the tool won't handle it, so we'll do this other thing instead. The problem with that is it all comes down to the process that we talked about earlier. If you have a process of using a tool like this, but you sometimes don't follow that process because the tool doesn't handle the type of change you want to make, then it can make it difficult for new team members joining the team to understand how they should do deployments. It makes it very difficult to get the oversight of what's going on if you're deploying in two different ways. And so yeah, how are you going to override it when you want to make one of these changes that the tool doesn't handle? And obviously the tool will normally alert you to the fact it's going to lose data, but again, it's just something to bear in mind that you have to actually go and look at those warnings it's generated and make sure you don't ignore them and deploy anyway. So we've kind of talked about state-based deployments, about kind of keeping the states and then the tool working out the process or the recipe or how to make that change. So what's the alternative, Tom?
Well, you've certainly convinced me that there are problems. So the alternative, I guess, which is also used, is a migrations-based solution. So the difference here is that we don't concern ourselves with the before and after states. We're not interested in where we're trying to get to. What we're interested in is how we get there. And so to go back to that analogy of the cake, this is the recipe. This is the list, the set of instructions that actually, when pieced together, will provide us with an exact definition of how to get from our previous state to our next state. And so this is very much, I guess, in keeping with that idea of shifting left. You know, you're deciding right at the point of development how you're going to deploy this change later on. And each individual incremental script can be saved and then concatenated together when it comes to producing the final deployment script out to your target environment. So a very different approach, and surely much better, right?
Well, yes. So if it comes to baking cakes, having a recipe to follow is absolutely, like, I could not cope without it. And baking cakes is very easy because we tend not to branch and merge cake recipes. But the problem with development is that we often do branching and then merging those branches back together. And the problem with these migration scripts is that if you've got some migration scripts on this branch and some migration scripts on this branch, when you merge the two branches together, what order do you run those migration scripts in? And of course, the order of migration scripts matters because if you've got two branches that are each changing a stored procedure, and then you merge the two branches together, well, the last change to a stored procedure wins, because when you do an alter proc statement in SQL Server, it's the last alter proc that wins. And so because the order matters, and because if you're not careful, you can easily miss these conflicts if you've got these two stored procedures being changed on the different branches. The other problem is it can lead to a very long deployment script. So let's say we work in 2-week sprints, and at the end of the 2 weeks, we release our changes. Over that 2 weeks, we might change that stored procedure a lot of times as we kind of iterate on it. And each time we change the stored procedure, that creates a migration script, and then we come to the end of the 2 weeks and we create the overall deployment script, which is all the migration scripts concatenated together, and we give that to, say, our DBA to review as part of the code review process in Visual Studio Team Services. So when he reviews that script, what he'll see is the stored procedure changing an awful lot of times. And obviously, he can just scroll to the end and pick the last one. But it makes it quite difficult to follow these deployment scripts because objects keep changing all the time. And then back to our recipe analogy, it would be the recipe telling you to do something, then telling you to undo it and do something else, and then do something else. So it can make it quite difficult to follow and then quite difficult to review these things. So what we've looked at is we've looked at two approaches, and neither of them is perfect. They both kind of have problems with them that we've talked about. So at this point, let's kind of, we're not the first people to have kind of come across these solutions or these problems. So let's look at some of the thought leaders in the industry and what they're saying. Tom?
Yeah, you're quite right. I mean, there's very strong views in the industry on which is the right approach. So first of all, here we have a quote from Gert Drapers, who built Datadude. And as soon as you have multiple changes on a single aspect of an object, ordering and the ability to detect which change needs to be made gets very complicated. Very true, and it goes back to the points that you were making just a moment ago about some of the problems, some of the complexities. But then on the other side of this, we actually have an alternative point of view which supports our other example here. There's nothing more reliable than keeping track of exactly the scripts you intend to run and running them without trying to compare state and guess. So, we kind of need to make a choice. We need to decide which one is best for us. Is it the migrations-based approach, or is it the traditional state-based approach that we might be familiar with from previous methods of deploying database changes?
So which one of these approaches should we use for DevOps? Well, at this point, I want to come back to the DevOps principles and practices. And one of those practices is the idea of shifting left. And that's taking things that we would discover at, say, deployment time and bringing those issues to the forefront of developers' minds. And it's about increasing that collaboration between the development and the operations side. It's about, by knowing these things up front, it reduces the chance of things going wrong at the end. And so because of that DevOps principle of shift left, and also because of the kind of the repeatable nature of migrations, that's why the migrations approach lends itself naturally to DevOps. So the idea is that we can take these migration scripts, concatenate them all together into a deployment script, and we can run these same identical migration scripts against all of our environments using the release side of things in Visual Studio Team Services. So when we do a deployment to testing and when we do a deployment to staging, we're running exactly the same migration scripts. And that repeatability is what we're after here. It's a matter of when that deployment to testing goes okay, knowing that when we deploy the same scripts to staging, we'll get exactly the same results. And when we deploy the same script to production, we'll get exactly the same results. If we're using a state-based approach, then we're using a tool to kind of guess what the deployment script is. Maybe we've updated the version of that tool in our build agents. Maybe it's generating a different script in this environment for some reason. But so the real cool advantage of using migrations is that we get this repeatable nature of the deployment. And we'll talk later about how some of the problems with migrations, such as branching and merging and stored procedures, you can mitigate by using the tools that we're going to show you to help you kind of bring your productivity of using migrations kind of up to the next level. So we're going to use the migrations approach because it lends itself naturally to DevOps and the DevOps principles and practices.
And this is where the Redgate components come in, right? This is where Redgate steps into the fold, because ReadyRoll is actually going to use this approach to enable you to source control your changes, those migration scripts that David was speaking about, and use those when it comes to deployment time. Even better, ReadyRoll is actually going to suggest those migration scripts for us at the beginning but we have the power to tweak them. We have the power to adjust them so that we can control exactly how that deployment takes place, just like David described. Now, if you're using some of the previous approaches, Redgate offer an existing approach based on the state-based model. Of course, we have DAC packs and things like that in the mix that you can use, but you don't get that control, right? You don't get that ability to actually define, this is how I want this change to be made. Yes, we do get some of the ability to produce a suggested change script, but we can't edit it because we don't know what it looks like. It doesn't happen till the end. So with ReadyRoll, you define how your change is going to be made, and that change is stored in source control and used exactly as defined when it comes to deployment time. David's prepared an example for us using a sample database that we've set up an existing project for, so we can see exactly how we control those deployment scripts and how they actually get deployed. David, are you all set and ready to go?
Cool. I think we've switched over to the computer now. So in the example today, what I'm going to talk you through is Parts Unlimited. Now, Parts Unlimited, it's an online e-commerce trading website, and what it does is it sells parts for cars. And at the moment, it sells to the US market, and so the products are priced in US dollars. And what the company wants to do, this Parts Unlimited company, is it wants to branch out to selling to the UK market as well. And obviously, the currency in the UK is Great British Pounds, and so what the company wants to do is it wants to price its products independently in the two currencies to help it better compete against its different competitors in the different markets. So what the company has asked us to do is to deliver these changes. Now, obviously, there's going to be changes to the website, which, for the sake of time today, we're not going to focus on. But what we're going to focus on today is the changes we're going to have to make to the database. So we've got this product table here, and if we take a look at this in the designer, we can see that it's got a whole bunch of columns in this table. And one of those columns is the price column. So the price column is currently storing the price in US dollars. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this price column to better reflect what's currently being stored in that column. I'm then going to add a new column, which is the price in Great British Pounds. And that's going to be a decimal 18.2, so that we can store kind of the pennies as well as the pounds. So that's how easy it is to make the changes in the designer for the changes we want to make. And what I'm going to do next is I'm just going to update the development database to have those changes by clicking the Update Database button. So what we've done now is we've updated our development database to have the changes to those columns. And now we're going to start using the Redgate tools. So the first tool we're going to use is this Redgate ReadyRoll tool. So if I click the refresh button here, what's going to happen is the ReadyRoll tool is going to analyze our development database, and it's going to see what changes we've made to that database. And you can see it's identified here that I've changed the product table and I've altered that table. If I click Import and Generate Script, what the ReadyRoll tool does is it generates me the migration script to deploy that change that I've made to the different environments. Now you can see that it's correctly identified we've renamed one of the columns, and it's also identified that we've added this new column here. Now this is about shifting left. So if we'd use a state-based tool as part of our deployment in Visual Studio Team Services, then this script would have been generated at deployment type. If we'd used DAC packs or any of the other kind of state-based tools, this script would have been generated at deployment time, and we wouldn't really have had the chance to review it, and crucially, we wouldn't have had the chance to edit it. And what we're going to do now is we're going to see how this script, whilst it makes the necessary changes to the schema, it doesn't change the data in the database. So if we look at the data in this table right now, we can see that we've got this new column, but it hasn't got any data in it. And because there's no data in this column, this might cause some issue for our website. Maybe we sell these things and just give them away for free. Maybe the website crashes because there's no price here. Either way, the database change isn't sufficient, what we've done so far. We need to be able to populate this column with data during our deployment. So one of the great things about using a migrations-based approach is we can edit the migration script. Okay, this is the default script it generated, but I can start typing in here to edit that migration script. So one of the tools I'm going to use to help me make those changes to this migration script is another tool from Redgate called SQL Prompt. It's our IntelliSense tool, and it just makes writing SQL so much easier. So I can type up, and it's suggesting update, and I'm going to update the product table, and I'm going to set this new price GBP column to equal the price US dollars column. It just makes it so much easier to type the SQL. We're going to pick the exchange rate of 0.8 just as a kind of starting point, and obviously later on, any of the people who work in the company can obviously go in and change the prices of the items later. But to start with, we're just going to pick this exchange rate. So if I save that migration script, then I'm also going to need to run this line of code against my development database. So let's just run that single update statement, come over here, click the refresh button, and you can see that we've now got some data in this column. So that's kind of my development database done. And now let's think about all the other environments we've got. We've got my teammates. We've also got all the environments which we manage deployments to through Visual Studio Team Services. So one of the things the ReadyRoll tool will let me do is it will let me refresh and just verify this script. So this is kind of similar to doing like a compile in the C# code. Basically, it's just checking that everything is good about this script, and I'm not going to break the build when I push this script. So in the same way that we'd compile our application code before committing, with ReadyRoll, we can click that verify button to know that everything is going to be good when we do the commit. That's the change I want to make, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to name this migration script and give it a better name. We're going to see this name in some of the reports in Visual Studio Team Services later, so by giving this thing a name, it's going to make it easy to identify it. So this is, let's go with International Expansion, just to kind of describe what my change is. So the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to go into Team Explorer, and we're going to commit these changes to Visual Studio Team Services. And by committing these changes to Visual Studio Team Services, it means that they can be built and they can be deployed to all the different environments. So again, let's add a commit comment, International Expansion, and commit and push that change. Cool. So that's how easy it is to make the change to our development database and then use the ReadyRoll tool to generate the migration script. Use the SQL prompt tool to help us edit the migration script, and then use the Visual Studio Team Explorer to commit that change to Visual Studio Team Services. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to come, I'm going to Alt-Tab over to Visual Studio Team Services, and we can kind of see what things look like in this side of things. So to start with, I've got an extension installed into Visual Studio Team Services, which is the ReadyRoll extension. And you can download this from the marketplace, where you can get a whole bunch of other extensions as well. So if you're using Visual Studio Team Services, you can just click the install button, and it will install it. If you're still using Team Foundation Server, then we support that as well, and you can just click the download button. So back to Visual Studio Team Services. So we've now committed our change to source control. And so now let's look at our build and our release pipeline. So in the build pipeline, let's just refresh this. And in fact, the build's already finished because, yeah, awesome. It completed 39 seconds ago. The build's already finished. And what this build did is it basically did exactly what we did by clicking that refresh and verify button in Visual Studio. It just checked that our migration script was valid. It ran it against SQL Server to check that that SQL was valid, and it did what we thought it was going to do. So in terms of the necessary configuration that we had to make this build happen, because the ReadyRoll is just another project in your solution, all you need to do in Visual Studio Team Services is just build the solution as you normally would. There are a couple of extra parameters you have to pass into ReadyRoll to tell it kind of where it should be, which database service it should be using. And the documentation makes it really easy to kind of follow and know what those parameters should be. If you've got an application side of things, then chances are you're doing the build of that application. So just add the ReadyRoll project to your application solution, add these extra arguments, and then it will build as part of your application. Similarly, in the same way that you can write unit tests for application code, you can write unit tests for database code as well. So if we go to add task here and we scroll down, one of these tasks will be, in fact, there's so many of these, let's use the search box here. So if we do, that is not showing up. There it is, yeah. So if we run T-SQL T-Test, so T-SQL T is a unit testing framework, just as NUnit is to application code, T-SQL T is the same thing to database code. And so we've got this extra build task here that lets you kind of run database unit tests as part of your build to get you that extra confidence. And that's another one of the DevOps principles, is this kind of testing. And so the ReadyRoll system has got this task that you can add to your build to make it really easy to run these tests. So that's kind of the build side of things. This is the build that completed earlier. So one of the other things that the Ready Role extension does in Visual Studio Team Services is it puts this little UI widget at the bottom here that kind of gives you a summary of the database changes that are included in this build. And we can see we've got this migration script we've added for international expansion, and we can see what it's doing. It's changing this product table. If we want, we can go over to a diff report, and this gives us a full diff of what's happening on that database. We can see that we've removed the price column and turned it into price US dollars. We've added a comma to the end of this line, and then we've added this price GBP column at the bottom here. We can also go and see the script that will be executed to make this change. And so if we scroll down in this script here, we can see that exactly the same script that I wrote in Visual Studio, it's got this update line in the script. And that's really the cool thing about this migrations approach. And it's why the migrations approach lends itself naturally to DevOps, which is that we've shifted left the idea of we need to deploy this thing to production. So let's start thinking about it as soon as possible. How are we going to deploy this to production? Oh, we're going to use this script. Great. Let's get that script in source control, and let's use that script in all the different environments. Let's use it in our CI environment during build, and when we start deploying out to all our other environments, let's reuse that same script so that we've got the confidence that if our tests pass because that SQL ran, then when we do deployment to production, we'll run the same SQL, so we'll get the same result. So that's kind of the build side of things, and now let's go over to the release side of things. So if I just take a look at so Visual Studio Team Services is completely flexible. You can configure it however you like. The way we've configured things in our pipeline is that on every single successful build, it will deploy out to a CI environment. But if you don't want to do that, that's fine. If you want to have so we've only got 2 environments here to kind of make the demo a bit faster. We've got a CI environment and a production environment. But if you want, testing or staging, that's, again, it's completely configurable. So you can just go into edit, and then you can add all the different environments you've got. So in terms of how we do that deployment, again, we use the Ready Role extension to Visual Studio Team Services. It adds this task. Again, Visual Studio Team Services has got so many tasks. And again, you can get more of these tasks from the marketplace. But the Ready Role task is right here. So what we've done is by adding this task into our pipeline, we can deploy the database as part of everything else. Again, I'm not showing it here for simplicity, but if you've got kind of anything else, maybe you've got an Azure website you want to deploy or kind of anything, you can do that as part of the same automated process. So that when you click the deploy button or when it automatically deploys for you, it's deploying the application code and the database change all together as part of a release being managed through this web interface. So again, it's really easy to configure. Basically, you just have to tell us which SQL server you want to deploy to and the credentials to go and make that change. The credentials are being stored as variables in Visual Studio Team Services. So if we look at where those variables are, we can see the database name is here and the username and password here. And by clicking this lock on the password, it keeps that password encrypted and secure so that people can't get that password out. And that means that our development team can come and type the passwords in, and they can set all the approvers on Visual Studio Team Services so that the development team in question have permissions to deploy to some environments, but maybe other environments require different approvers or that kind of thing. And it's all completely configurable for the pipeline that you want. What the Ready Role tool does is it brings the database into that pipeline. So let me just promote that release to the production environment. Again, we haven't got any kind of approvers configured here. It will just let me deploy it. But obviously, in your environment, you'd have any kind of necessary security or whatever sign-offs that you've got. And that release is now going out to production. And now what it will do is it will run exactly the same migration script against the production database. And it's that easy to make a change and to deploy it out to the different environments using Visual Studio Team Services. So at this point, we're going to go back to the slides, and Tom's going to talk you through, let's go back to the slides, and Tom's going to talk you through kind of one of the ways that Ready Role is slightly better than just the migrations tool.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. That was an excellent demonstration. And we saw there as well SQL Prompt, which, of course, SQL Prompt Core is included for Visual Studio Enterprise subscribers as well. If you're not a Visual Studio Enterprise subscriber, again, you can get access to SQL Prompt. Head over to the Redgate website, and you'll be able to download a trial there. Now, David spoke about the migrations approach being naturally better suited to DevOps practices. But of course he did, you have to admit, David, you did admit that there were some drawbacks, some things that weren't available when you adopt a migrations-based approach. And that's why actually with ReadyRoll Pro, you can take more of a hybrid approach so that you have that fine-grained control over how you deal with your tables and your reference data. But actually when it comes to programmable objects like views, stored procedures, functions, those kind of things, you can still continue to use that state-based model where we actually dynamically work out how to change them at deployment time. And of course that's okay because they don't contain any data. David, can you show us how to do that within the product?
Cool, so I'm just going to switch back over to the computer. It should just be coming up now. Cool. So yeah, as Tom talked about, ReadyRoll is actually a hybrid tool. Although it supports migrations for table-based changes, we also support state for programmable object changes. So if I go onto the project settings page, there's a big button which just, so if we switch to this and then just click the magic button, what that does is it switches us over to using a mixed mode. So while we're using migrations for table changes, for programmable objects, we're using a state-based deployment approach. And what that means is that we've got this file here for this programmable object, and what the file does is it just contains a drop of the object at the top if it already exists, and then it creates the procedure. If you're using the newest version of SQL Server, you can also use create or alter as a syntax here as well. So what this means is that because this is in a fixed file in your project, it's at a fixed location, when you merge two branches together, you'll get a merge conflict in your source control tool, and then you can fix that merge so that the changes to the stored procedures can be made across the two branches. Then when ReadyRoll does its deployment to Visual Studio Team Services, it will just deploy all the migrations first and then all the programmable objects after them. And that means that because we're now a hybrid, problems with the migrations approach, such as ordering changes to stored procedures, potentially losing them when people merge branches, very, very long overall deployment scripts because this stored procedure keeps changing over and over again in these migration scripts. Those problems have now gone away by using this hybrid approach. And that's one of the cool things about the ReadyRoll tool. It uses migrations for where they're best for table changes, where you want precise control over the data and what's going on in that table. And it uses the state-based approach for programmable objects. So you get the precise control of what's going on with branching and merging, and you mitigate all the problems of long deployment scripts. So this hybrid approach of using the best of both worlds, all enabled through this tool. When you click this refresh button here, it will analyze the database, changes to tables, go in the migrations folder, changes to stored procedures, go in the programmable objects folder. And then there's absolutely no configuration change we need to make to Visual Studio Team Services to deploy this new change setting. Once we commit these changes to source control, all the existing configuration in Visual Studio Team Services will just pick it up and deploy it as it already is. So at this point, should we go into some questions, Tom? Because we've been going for 47 minutes, and most of the questions have been coming in. So should we start with that one?
Yeah,
read it out?
Sure. Let's go through some of these. So first of all, David, what's the benefit of using Redgate tools over DAC packs?
So the first thing to point out is that it's an alternative to DAC packs. So DAC packs and the SSDT way of doing things is just an alternative to the ReadyRoll approach. And it all depends on kind of what type of process you want to follow. We talked about some of the benefits of the ReadyRoll approach, but there are also some benefits of the DAC pack approach as well. And it all comes down to what you want to do, because as we started the quote at the beginning, DevOps is all about a group of people following a process and using some products to help them. If for your team, the process that you want to follow, maybe DAC packs, maybe the benefits from DAC packs are better for you, or maybe the benefits from ReadyRoll are better for you. What I hope we've done in the webinar today is shown you how the ReadyRoll tool and its integration with Visual Studio Team Services and this shift left concept of bringing the script back to development so that we can make these changes to the script. Hopefully that's kind of one of the benefits of ReadyRoll that you've seen today, but it's just an alternative to using DAC packs. It's all about what works for you and your team, what keeps your people happy and productive and delivering the business benefits for you.
Fantastic, thank you. We had another question. Is everything you've demoed today available in Visual Studio Community? Well, Redgate data tools come with Visual Studio Enterprise at no extra cost. However, if you are using Visual Studio Community, don't worry. There's a free 28-day trial of the products that we've seen available on redgate.com. So you can head there, download those, and yes, you can use them in Visual Studio Community. However, they don't come included, I'm afraid.
Yeah, so that's the cool thing about if you've got Visual Studio Enterprise, the core editions of the Redgate tools, ReadyRoll Core and SQL Prompt Core, come as part of your Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. But if you haven't got Enterprise, as Tom points out, you can get the free trials from redgate.com.
Another really interesting question here. What's the difference between Agile and DevOps?
That is a very good question. And
so would you say that Agile, I guess, David, is kind of the first phase, and it brought development and testing closer together, so that we took down some of those boundaries between those two teams. However, DevOps takes that a step further, so it's almost like the second phase of Agile, where I guess we're bringing together operations into that mix.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a whole bunch of kind of principles and practices that make up Agile, and there's a whole bunch of principles and practices that make up kind of DevOps. And there's a lot of overlap between the two. But DevOps is all about kind of getting the feedback from users. And so while, for example, in Agile, yes, we might have 2-week sprints, and yes, we might kind of have these sprints. In DevOps, it's about getting the feedback from customers. And one of my other co-presenters has pointed out that DevOps is the second decade of Agile. What we want to do is we want to start bringing into the release and the operations teams as well, so you get this learning from running the applications to bring that back into the planning cycle. So though we haven't shown it today, DevOps is just way more than just this ReadyRoll tool. It's about kind of monitoring. I know Ed talked about kind of application insights at the beginning as well.
So another question that we had, David, here, is a recording available after? Yes, we're certainly recording, so this will be made available. You can certainly catch up on this later. David, actually, you touched on a point there. You said, you know, it's more than just tooling. It's more than just what we've seen. It's about monitoring. It's about provisioning. It's about all these different things. And in general, DevOps is, as you said earlier, it's about the people as well as the process. But the tooling helps, right? It accelerates adoption of the approach. So when you have the right tools, it brings down some of those barriers and makes it easier for the people and the process to fit and to work and to run smoothly. So Redgate do offer tools across the wider scope of DevOps, the areas that David mentioned there. You can see on the diagram on the screen here, all the way from provisioning right at the beginning to create those development environments, through making those changes, build, validating and testing, packaging and releasing the changes which we've seen today, and then on to monitoring, optimizing, and of course backing up your code. So there is an area outside of just the section that we've seen, and you know, we'd really love to speak to you if you have an interest in areas outside of this. But for today, I want to. We've had one extra question.
Yeah, we've had a couple more questions. So one is, how does the ReadyRoll tool handle the incremental deployment of migrations? So what the ReadyRoll tool does is it adds a new table to your database that keeps track of which migration scripts have run before. And when we do a deployment, what we do is we analyze that table, we see what migration scripts you've deployed before, and if you've deployed a migration script before, we don't deploy it again. So by reading that table, we can see which migration scripts have been deployed before, and then we only deploy the new migration scripts to that database. And at the same time, we record in the table that we've run them, so that for the next deployment, they don't get run again. And that means that you can use ReadyRoll for both an initial deployment to like a greenfield brand new database that you've just kind of created, but you can also use it to incrementally update databases over time as well. Another question is, how does the ReadyRoll address the sequencing issue that we described earlier? So in terms of how the sequencing works, all the migration scripts have just got a number, which is what order you want to run them in, and it's completely visible in all the tools. It's completely visible in all the kind of in the code review side of things. And you can change these numbers if you want to change the sequencing. And we talked about how for branching and merging in stored procedures, you can turn on this programmable object, which means that if you are changing the stored procedure in both branches, you'll get that merge conflict when you merge, and you can work out what's going on. Another question is, can ReadyRoll verify that a migrated database matches the new or the full build of the database? Yes, it can. There's a couple of ways it can do that. So one of the ways of doing it is basically when you click the refresh button in Visual Studio, what you're seeing is a comparison between your development database and the migration scripts in the Visual Studio project and what they do. So if that comparison shows you a difference, like when it showed me a difference earlier when I've made a change to the product table. That difference could be because you've changed the development database, and that's a difference that you want to import into the project. But that difference could also be because the migration scripts aren't doing what they should be doing. And so when you look at those differences in the ReadyRoll tool window in Visual Studio, you can go, oh, that's not what I was expecting. Maybe the migration scripts aren't doing the right thing. You can edit the migration script, click the refresh button, and it will sort itself out. We have another question about how do you handle database drift? So database drift, as I talked about earlier, is one of the ways that you might kind of make a change on production to do a performance hotfix. So in Visual Studio Team Services, we have a kind of a task that you can run that will analyze the database and give you a report about any drift. So what you can do once you've got that report about that drift is you can bring we also generate the SQL script as well to both correct the drift and to adopt the drift in the development environment. So you can bring that index that was created in production back into the project. And so now that index has been taken account and can be created in the test environment so you can be testing with that index. One of the other options is to just blow away the drift if you want to get rid of it, and we have an option to do that as well. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of options in our build side of things which you can run through Visual Studio Team Services.
So it's worth mentioning that we have a few minutes left of our allotted time. So just while we're waiting for those last few questions to come in, I just want to talk a little bit about the next steps. So first of all, I really strongly encourage you to create a free Visual Studio Team Services account so that you can try for yourself exactly what we've seen David walk us through today. As we've mentioned lots of times, Visual Studio Enterprise subscribers, you get ReadyRoll Core and SQL Prompt Core available as long as you've chosen to include that data storage and processing workload. If you haven't done, don't worry, you can head over to the VS Marketplace and grab it from there. If you're not a Visual Studio Enterprise subscriber, then you can still get access to this technology. You can try ReadyRoll Pro and SQL Prompt Pro and some of the wider tools that we spoke about from the rest of the DevOps picture by heading over to the Redgate website. Free 28-day trials are available. And if you're really interested in DevOps and want to learn all about how Redgate apply its technology to this hugely exciting area, then please head on to redgate.com/solutions. David, any final questions coming in?
Yeah, we have another one, which is there an option when generating the migration scripts to always include conditional checks? As the scripts are deployed to different environments due to database schema drift, the scripts may fail. And the author of the question says that this is one of the issues they've encountered with SQL Server data tools, which we talked about earlier as an alternative to ReadyRoll. So yeah, you can include them. So the way that ReadyRoll generates these migration scripts is by using the Redgate comparison engine technology. And that's completely configurable, and we have a whole bunch of options that you can set up. So if you go ahead and change the default options for generating these scripts, then we'll generate them with these object existence checks for you. So we only actually create objects if they already exist. So that's one of the options. So of course you could edit the scripts all by hand, but that's a bit tedious. So yeah, we have that option for when we automatically generate these scripts for a way for you to step in and say, actually, no, I always want you to add these things automatically for you. Then the migration scripts will come up with that already added. And of course you can still edit the scripts to your heart's content as well. We have another question that's come in. Say you've got 3 scripts, 3 migration scripts, and they're all valid SQL. But when you run the second script, there's a SQL exception. Now the target is in an inconsistent state. Are all the scripts going to be in a big transaction so they roll back? And yeah, absolutely. By default, when we generate that overall deployment script, what we do is we put a begin transaction at the beginning. We then have all of your migration scripts, one after the other, that haven't run against that database before. And then we put a commit transaction at the end. And so that means that by default, the migration scripts all run in one transaction. You can change that default if you don't want it, but that is the default. We have another question, which is how does this work with Entity Framework code first migrations? So the Entity Framework is another alternative, just as SSDT and ReadyRoll. Entity Framework code first migrations is another alternative. Although I say it's an alternative, there is a way of getting ReadyRoll and Entity Framework to work together. So if you want to use Entity Framework as your ORM to help you talk to SQL Server, but you want to use ReadyRoll to manage kind of the migrations and the deployments, then you can totally do that. And we have a documentation page around kind of bringing ReadyRoll and Entity Framework together. But if you just want to use Entity Framework and code first migrations, that's another alternative to ReadyRoll. It's all about what works for you, on your team, for your process, and what kind of helps you deliver value to your customers.
So I think we are probably out of time in terms of all the questions. So thank you, David, for a fantastic demo going through those questions. I hope that you've all seen how easy it is working with Visual Studio Team Services, Visual Studio Enterprise, and the Redgate technology, ReadyRoll and SQL Prompt. You can bring DevOps to the database very, very simply. So, Ed, thank you so much for inviting us to talk. Back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Tom and David. I really appreciate it. This has been a very hot topic. We have so many people who have been live today, and we'll certainly make this recording available. So thank you again. You did the first webinar in our Spring into DevOps month. For everyone else, be sure to head back to the Spring into DevOps page, and we're going to have more webinars for the rest of the month. So looking forward to having you then. Thank you again, Tom and David.
Cool. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, everyone.